Behind the dazzling lights of British television and cinema from the 1960s to the 1990s lay a chilling reality. We idolized them on screen, but behind closed doors, some of the biggest stars were ruthless dictators of fate. If a young talent refused their highly personal demands, their career was brutally dismantled overnight. Today, we expose 10 powerful idols who destroyed lives out of pure rejection. Before we uncover these dark secrets, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments whose story shocks you the most. Jimmy Savile. For decades, he was the untouchable king of British television, an eccentric and highly celebrated figure who captured the hearts of millions. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, his peculiar charm made him an absolute national treasure. He presented the most popular entertainment programs, holding the golden key to mainstream success for countless aspiring artists. To be invited onto his show was considered the ultimate breakthrough, a guaranteed ticket to fame. However, this immense influence masked a deeply sinister reality that would only be uncovered many years later. Beneath the jovial public persona lay a ruthless and manipulative figure who used his immense broadcasting power as a devastating weapon. Young hopefuls, eager to make their mark in the highly competitive world of show business, often found themselves cornered in dressing rooms or dark studio corridors. It was in these hidden moments that the beloved entertainer would make his highly inappropriate demands. He expected complete submission, assuming his legendary status meant nobody would dare to refuse his personal advances. When a rising star found the courage to turn him down, his reaction was a cold and calculated mission to utterly destroy their professional prospects. He possessed an incredible network of influential friends, stretching from senior television executives to powerful political figures. With a simple whisper in the right ear, he could ensure that a young talent was completely blacklisted from the entire industry. Promising singers and dancers would suddenly find their contracts permanently cancelled and their names entirely erased from casting lists. The psychological devastation inflicted upon these individuals was truly heartbreaking. They had their lifelong dreams snatched away in an instant, utterly powerless to fight back against a man who was treated like a living saint by the establishment. When they tried to warn others, they were dismissed as bitter or ignored by a culture that fiercely protected its assets. Producers quickly branded them as difficult to work with, completely unaware of the vindictive campaign orchestrated behind the scenes to ruin their reputations. Many of these bright young talents were eventually forced to abandon the entertainment industry altogether. They packed their bags and tried to rebuild their shattered lives in complete obscurity. They carried the heavy burden of knowing exactly why their careers had abruptly ended, watching helplessly as the man who destroyed them was knighted and adored by the British public. The profound injustice of seeing him celebrated while crushing the spirits of the innocent left deep, unhealed scars. It was only after he passed away in 2011 that the terrifying scale of his vindictive nature was finally exposed to the world. The devastating truth revealed that he was a tyrannical figure who ruined the lives of anyone who refused to comply with his dark desires. His brutal legacy remains one of the darkest chapters in television history, a constant reminder of how absolute fame can be twisted into a weapon of silence. Michael Winner. Stepping away from the cheerful facade of family entertainment, the British film industry harbored its own breed of merciless dictators. During the 1970s and 1980s, few figures wielded as much terrifying influence as this particular director and television personality. He was a flamboyant, larger-than-life character who presented himself as an eccentric aristocrat of the cinematic world. Audiences loved his loud demeanor and frequent television appearances, completely oblivious to his toxic backstage reign. To be cast in one of his major motion pictures was a golden opportunity for any young British actress. He held the keys to international stardom, but his auditions were notoriously unconventional and deeply uncomfortable. He operated a fiercely guarded casting system, turning professional meetings into highly inappropriate personal interrogations. He demanded a profound level of intimate affection from his leading ladies, viewing their physical compliance as a mandatory condition for securing a lucrative contract. If a brave actress firmly declined his highly personal propositions, his reaction was nothing short of volcanic. The polite, charming gentleman would instantly transform into a vindictive tyrant, determined to make her pay for the perceived humiliation. He would not only throw her out of his office, but he would immediately pick up the telephone to his vast network of powerful industry friends. His primary goal was to ensure that the young woman would never find significant work in British cinema ever again. He aggressively spread malicious rumors, falsely claiming these talented women were terribly difficult on set or entirely lacked the necessary acting abilities. Because he was so exceptionally powerful and financially successful, studio executives blindly believed his deceitful narratives without question. Dozens of promising careers were abruptly halted before they could even truly begin, leaving gifted performers completely frozen out of the mainstream theater and mainstream television broadcasting circles. The psychological toll on the rejected actresses was absolutely catastrophic. They watched in deep despair as less talented peers were catapulted to stardom, knowing that their own rigid moral boundaries had ultimately cost them their professional livelihoods. Many suffered in absolute silence, deeply ashamed and terribly afraid of his legendary temper and immense legal power. To speak out against him during the 1980s would have meant absolute professional ruin, as the deeply flawed system fiercely protected its creators. Only decades later did the grim reality of his terrible casting methods slowly begin to surface in the wider public domain. The glamorous public image he had so carefully cultivated over the years finally fractured, revealing a deeply cruel individual who routinely used his directorial authority to manipulate and punish vulnerable young artists. His extensive cinematic legacy is now permanently overshadowed by the dark truth of his actions, serving as a bleak historical reminder of the dreadful cost of ambition in an unforgiving industry. Max Clifford. Moving away from the director's chair, the dark heart of British fame was often controlled by the architects of public relations. During the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, no single individual held more power over the tabloids than this notorious media mastermind. He was the supreme gatekeeper of the front pages, capable of turning an unknown face into a household name overnight. Everyone in the entertainment business knew that his blessing was absolutely essential for mainstream survival. However, his heavily guarded office was not just a place where newspaper deals were struck, it was the center of a highly manipulative operation. He promised young, aspiring models and actresses the absolute world, assuring them that his unique connections could guarantee them endless magazine covers and lucrative television appearances. But these grand promises always came with an unspoken, deeply sinister condition. He expected a highly inappropriate level of intimate personal gratitude in return for his professional services. When a brave young woman decided to maintain her dignity and firmly reject his highly inappropriate advances, the atmosphere would change in an instant. The charming, softly spoken publicist would completely vanish, replaced by a terrifyingly vindictive enemy. He did not simply show them the door, he made it his absolute personal mission to ensure their aspirations were completely annihilated. He viewed their firm refusal as a deep personal insult that required the most severe professional punishment imaginable. His method of vengeance was as cold as it was incredibly effective. Using his immense influence over the British press, he would quietly instruct newspaper editors and powerful casting directors to completely ignore the dissenting talent. If that was not enough, he would deliberately plant completely false, highly damaging stories in the Sunday papers to permanently stain their fragile public reputations. He had the unparalleled power to make these young women look completely unemployable, ensuring that their telephone would never ring again. The psychological devastation he caused was absolutely immeasurable. Dozens of promising careers were abruptly suffocated, leaving these young women completely destitute and severely traumatized. They were utterly powerless against a man who practically owned the British media landscape. Many of them spiraled into deep despair, eventually abandoning the capital city and their lifelong ambitions, forever haunted by the dreadful realization that morality had essentially cost them their entire future in the dazzling spotlight. For decades, he operated with absolute impunity, sitting comfortably at the very top of the celebrity hierarchy while his vulnerable victims suffered in profound silence. It was only well into the 2000s that the horrifying truth of his coercive empire finally collapsed under the weight of historical police investigations. The man who had mercilessly destroyed the lives of those who refused his dark desires finally faced the harsh judgment of the courts, leaving behind a dreadful legacy of shattered dreams and terrifying manipulation. Jonathan King. Shifting our focus to the vibrant, pulsing heart of the British music industry, we find another deeply influential figure who operated entirely above the law. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, this prominent record producer and television presenter was heralded as an absolute genius hitmaker. He possessed an uncanny ability to spot raw talent, acting as the ultimate gatekeeper for aspiring musicians desperately seeking their first elusive record contract. His word was considered absolute gospel within the fiercely competitive corridors of major recording studios. Young singers and ambitious band members eagerly flocked to his luxurious offices, believing he held the magical formula for chart-topping success. He promised them nationwide radio exposure and highly coveted appearances on primetime television shows. However, these golden opportunities were strictly reserved for those who were willing to submit to his highly inappropriate personal demands. When an aspiring pop star had the courage to firmly decline his deeply unsettling propositions, the legendary producer would instantly flip a terrifying switch. The enthusiastic mentor transformed into a cold, vindictive adversary who absolutely despised the very notion of rejection. He did not simply show the defiant musician the door, he utilized his vast network of industry executives and radio controllers to ensure that their musical aspirations were thoroughly and permanently dismantled. His method of professional execution was completely devastating and practically invisible. A single telephone call from him was more than enough to have a promising debut single completely pulled from the national broadcasting playlists. He would actively pressure influential music journalists to completely ignore the dissenting artists, whilst warning rival record labels that signing them would result in severe professional consequences. The poor victims found themselves entirely erased from the scene. The emotional damage inflicted upon these young dreamers was profound and long-lasting. They were forced to watch their beloved bands dissolve and their lifelong musical ambitions turn to dust, simply because they refused to cross a rigid moral boundary. Lacking the financial resources or industry backing to fight such a colossal figure, many of these incredibly gifted musicians abandoned their guitars and microphones forever, fading into complete obscurity while their tormentor continued to thrive. For decades, he reveled in his immense power, frequently appearing on television screens as a quirky, authoritative voice of pop culture, completely untouched by the trail of shattered lives he left in his wake. It took many years for the dark whispers of his manipulative reign to finally reach the solemn halls of a courtroom in the early 2000s. His dramatic fall from grace exposed a deeply toxic environment, proving once again that absolute influence often breeds the most terrifying forms of cruelty. Huey Green. Delving into the wholesome realm of television talent shows, we encounter an individual who heavily manipulated the dreams of the working class. During the 1960s and 1970s, he was the undisputed king of Saturday night broadcasting. Presenting the most famous talent discovery program in the country, he possessed the unique ability to turn unknown individuals into overnight national sensations. Families gathered around their televisions, adoring his cheerful catchphrases and seemingly genuine support for nervous performers hoping for a lucky break. Behind this carefully manufactured image of a benevolent television uncle existed a fiercely demanding and deeply unpleasant tyrant. His private dressing room was considered exclusive territory, and young, vulnerable contestants were frequently summoned there under the guise of receiving vital professional guidance before the live broadcast. It was strictly behind these heavy doors that the powerful presenter would forcefully request profound personal favors, subtly tying their potential television success directly to their absolute obedience and intimate compliance. Should a terrified young singer or ambitious dancer gather the immense emotional strength to firmly push him away and reject his highly inappropriate advances, his charming demeanor would instantly evaporate. He was a man who absolutely loathed being denied anything he desired. Without a single moment of hesitation, he would actively alter the trajectory of the live television program to ensure the defiant performer suffered a humiliating public defeat. He deliberately manipulated audience reactions and instructed camera operators to highlight their mistakes. His terrible vengeance extended far beyond a single disastrous television broadcast. He maintained an absolute iron grip over the entire British variety circuit and heavily influenced numerous theatrical booking agents across the nation. If a brave performer had dared to reject his private propositions, he would furiously dispatch letters and make threatening telephone calls to ensure they were completely banned from performing in holiday camps and regional theaters. He systematically starved them of any viable opportunity to earn a living within the entertainment sector. The psychological burden carried by these discarded talents was incredibly tragic. They had briefly experienced the dazzling heat of the prominent studio lights, only to be violently shoved back into permanent obscurity simply because they maintained their personal morality. Many fell into deep, lingering despair, forever wondering what incredible heights their professional careers might have reached had they not encountered such a vindictive gatekeeper. They were forced to watch from the shadows as his immense wealth and celebrity status continued to flourish unchallenged. He eventually passed away in the late 1990s, initially leaving behind a celebrated public legacy that was slowly dismantled by shocking posthumous revelations. Only after his departure did the deeply uncomfortable stories of his severe backstage cruelty truly begin to circulate within the mainstream newspapers. The man who had supposedly launched 1,000 brilliant careers is now remembered by many industry insiders as a ruthless dictator who gleefully destroyed the artistic futures of those who possessed the sheer courage to decline his dark ultimatums. Larry Parks. Plunging deep into the vibrant and chaotic birth of British rock and roll, we uncover a mastermind who ruthlessly manufactured the very first wave of homegrown pop idols. During the late 1950s and throughout the roaring 1960s, this legendary music manager possessed an absolute monopoly over the charts. He was the ultimate star maker, famous for discovering exceptionally handsome working-class boys and transforming them into screaming teenage sensations overnight. He controlled absolutely everything, from the clothes they wore to the dramatic stage names he personally invented for them, holding the absolute keys to unimaginable fame and fortune. However, behind the gleaming chrome and hysterical concert halls, his management style operated on a deeply exploitative and sinister foundation. He ran his musical empire like an absolute dictatorship, demanding total surrender from the young men he supposedly nurtured. His luxurious London apartment served as the ultimate testing ground, where naive aspiring singers were frequently invited to discuss their impending record contracts. It was within these opulent walls that the powerful impresario would clearly outline his highly inappropriate conditions, expecting profound physical gratitude and intimate companionship in exchange for a glittering career. When a principled young musician found the tremendous courage to step back and firmly decline these deeply unsettling personal advances, the manager would unleash a terrifying fury. He did not simply dissolve their professional relationship and allow them to find another representative. Instead, he treated their refusal as an unforgivable act of treason that demanded total professional annihilation. The charming, fatherly figure would instantly vanish, replaced by a ruthless business shark who was completely determined to ensure the dissenting artist would never see the inside of a recording studio ever again. His methods of professional strangulation were both legally binding and incredibly cruel. Because these young artists had naively signed notoriously restrictive long-term contracts, he legally owned their stage names and their performing rights. He would systematically cancel all their upcoming concert dates, aggressively block their radio appearances, and completely refuse to release any of their recorded music. He essentially trapped them in a permanent legal purgatory, preventing them from seeking alternative management while simultaneously starving them of any opportunity to earn a basic living in the industry. The devastating psychological impact on these discarded young men was completely heartbreaking. They were forced to watch from the bleak sidelines as their former stablemates, who had quietly surrendered to the dark demands, were heavily promoted and catapulted to national stardom. Without any financial resources to fight his expensive lawyers, many talented singers simply faded into complete obscurity, their musical dreams completely crushed by a single, vindictive gatekeeper. They returned to their ordinary provincial lives, heavily burdened by the bitter knowledge that their strict moral boundaries had essentially cost them everything. He continued to operate with terrifying impunity for many years, quietly protected by an industry that prioritized hit records over the profound suffering of disposable youth. He eventually passed away in the late 1980s, leaving behind a massive fortune and a complex legacy. Only in the decades following his departure did the tragic testimonies of his forgotten victims finally emerge from the shadows. The glittering pioneer of British pop is now widely remembered as a deeply manipulative predator who gladly destroyed the futures of those who bravely refused to compromise their absolute personal dignity. Tam Paton. Turning our attention to the absolute hysteria of the British pop scene during the 1970s, we discover a mastermind who orchestrated a global musical phenomenon. He was the immensely powerful manager behind the biggest Scottish band of the decade, a man who generated millions in staggering record sales. The music press frequently hailed him as a visionary entrepreneur, but behind the tartan scarves and screaming crowds, he ran his empire like a deeply terrifying dictatorship, holding absolute power over his young stars. His luxurious mansion, located on the outskirts of Edinburgh, was not just a home. It was a heavily guarded fortress where he exerted suffocating control over his deeply naive clients. He provided them with international fame and immense adoration, but he demanded the complete surrender of their personal boundaries in return. He would frequently corner aspiring musicians and vulnerable session players, making his highly inappropriate conditions crystal clear. He expected profound, intimate companionship as the ultimate price for his professional backing. Whenever a principled young man found the immense courage to firmly reject his deeply unsettling personal advances, the powerful manager would unleash a terrifying and calculated wrath. He viewed any refusal as a direct challenge to his absolute authority. The charming fatherly figure would instantly vanish, replaced by a ruthless tyrant who would immediately isolate the dissenting individual. He would completely freeze their financial allowances and threaten to replace them overnight, weaponizing their deepest fears of failure to force compliance. His method of professional vengeance extended far beyond a simple dismissal. He actively sought to obliterate their entire future within the entertainment industry. Utilizing his tremendous influence over major recording labels and powerful television producers across the nation, he would firmly ensure that the rejected artist was completely blacklisted. He deliberately spread entirely fabricated rumors regarding their professional reliability, guaranteeing that no other respectable manager would ever dare to offer them a second chance. The psychological devastation inflicted upon these trapped young men was absolutely catastrophic. They found themselves locked inside a glittering nightmare, painfully aware that escaping his deeply abusive environment meant losing their only genuine opportunity at stardom while facing absolute financial ruin. Without any independent support system, many of these discarded musicians suffered profound emotional damage. They faded into quiet desperation, permanently silenced by his immense wealth and the terrifying threat of expensive legal retaliation. For several decades, he comfortably hid behind the colossal commercial triumphs of his famous clients, heavily protected by a fiercely competitive industry that deliberately ignored his dark, coercive methods. It was only much later, long after the phenomenal chart success had faded, that the horrifying truth of his manipulative reign was finally exposed within the solemn walls of the British courts. He ultimately passed away in 2009, leaving behind a profoundly stained legacy that serves as a bleak reminder of unchecked tyrannical authority. Rolf Harris. Shifting our gaze to the innocent world of family television, we find a man widely regarded as the lovable grandfather of broadcasting. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, this eccentric artist and musician captured the profound imagination of the nation. He was an absolute institution, famous for painting enormous canvases on screen and playing unusual instruments. Millions adored his gentle persona, making him one of the most trusted figures in the entire entertainment industry. However, the creative atmosphere that surrounded his television studios deliberately masked a deeply uncomfortable reality. His private dressing rooms and rehearsal spaces were certainly not the joyful environments they appeared to be. Instead, he constantly used his legendary, untouchable status to corner young production assistants and vulnerable staff members who genuinely idolized his work. He completely expected them to submit to his highly inappropriate physical demands behind closed doors. Whenever a courageous young woman firmly decided to establish her boundaries and reject his deeply unsettling personal advances, the jolly facade would instantly shatter. He viewed their justified refusal as a severe personal insult, totally unable to comprehend how anyone could deny a national treasure. The friendly television painter would immediately transform into a highly vindictive manipulator, determined to ensure the dissenting individual was swiftly removed from the production hierarchy. His calculated method of professional destruction was incredibly subtle, yet absolutely devastating. He would quietly approach senior television producers and influential network executives, falsely claiming that the young staff members in question were terribly incompetent or completely disrespectful towards him. Given his monumental status as a guaranteed ratings winner, the television executives always believed his deceitful narrative. The victims were entirely defenseless against his poisonous whispers. The profound psychological toll inflicted upon these discarded individuals was truly heartbreaking. They were suddenly pushed out of the television industry entirely, their promising broadcast careers abruptly terminated by the very man they had once deeply respected. They were forced to carry the terrible burden of his dark secret in absolute silence, terrified that speaking out against such a universally adored public figure would only result in severe, career-ending public humiliation. It was not until the dramatic police investigations of the early 2010s that the horrifying truth behind his beloved persona was finally dragged into the public spotlight. The shocking court trials completely dismantled his carefully crafted grandfatherly image, revealing a man who had ruthlessly exploited his immense power. He passed away in 2023, leaving behind a completely shattered legacy and serving as a chilling reminder of absolute deception. Stuart Hall. Stepping into the thrilling and deeply competitive world of British television sports broadcasting, we uncover another beloved national treasure who weaponized his legendary charm. During the 1970s and throughout the 1980s, this flamboyant presenter was universally adored for his eccentric vocabulary and hysterical laughter on popular physical game shows. He was the undisputed master of Saturday night entertainment, commanding massive audiences and wielding tremendous influence over the production companies that employed him. To work alongside him was considered a spectacular career move for any aspiring television professional. However, behind the booming laughter and the colorful jackets, the bustling television studios served as a deeply sinister hunting ground. He possessed an absolute sense of entitlement, firmly believing that his immense celebrity status granted him unrestricted access to the young women who worked behind the scenes. His dressing room was a notoriously uncomfortable space, where young researchers, aspiring presenters, and vulnerable fans were frequently invited under the false pretense of discussing upcoming broadcasts or receiving valuable industry advice. When a courageous young woman firmly decided to maintain her professional integrity and reject his highly inappropriate physical advances, the jovial public persona would instantly evaporate. The beloved sports commentator would transform into a terrifyingly vindictive adversary, absolutely furious that a junior staff member had dared to deny his personal desires. He viewed their justified refusal as a monumental insult to his enormous ego, and he immediately set out to guarantee their complete removal from the television industry. His calculated method of professional execution relied entirely on his monumental value to the broadcasting network. He would quietly approach the senior executive producers, heavily implying that the young woman in question was terribly difficult to work with or completely lacked the necessary skills for live television. Because he was the undisputed star of the network, the producers blindly accepted his malicious evaluations without a single moment of hesitation. The victims were completely powerless to defend themselves against his deeply toxic influence. The emotional devastation inflicted upon these discarded individuals was absolutely immeasurable. They had their lifelong broadcasting ambitions completely annihilated in an instant, utterly defenseless against a man who was treated like royalty by the entire British public. When they attempted to report his terrible behaviour to the television management, their concerns were routinely ignored or aggressively dismissed. They were forced to abandon their promising careers, carrying the heavy burden of his dark secret in profound silence. For decades, he continued to revel in his immense fame and fortune, completely untouched by the trail of shattered lives he left in his wake. He was even awarded prestigious honors by the establishment, further cementing his untouchable status. It was only during the monumental police investigations of 2012 that the horrifying truth of his manipulative reign was finally exposed. His dramatic imprisonment completely destroyed his glittering legacy, leaving behind a dreadful reminder of unchecked tyrannical authority within the broadcasting industry. Dave Lee Travis. Concluding our journey through the darkest shadows of the British entertainment industry, we tune into the absolute dominance of the national radio waves. During the 1970s and throughout the 1980s, this phenomenally popular disc jockey was the undisputed king of the morning broadcast. Millions of loyal listeners woke up to his booming voice and eccentric sound effects, completely unaware of the immense, unchecked power he wielded over the entire music business. He was the ultimate tastemaker, and his personal playlist decisions could guarantee an immediate #1 hit or completely sink a highly anticipated debut album in a matter of hours. Beyond the cheerful banter and the legendary nationwide summer roadshows, the bustling corridors of the broadcasting house concealed a deeply toxic environment. He fiercely exploited his monumental status as a beloved radio personality, frequently targeting vulnerable young promotional staff, junior production assistants, and aspiring female vocalists who desperately needed his crucial airplay. His private studio booth was a notoriously uncomfortable space where he would corner these ambitious women, demanding profound personal affection and highly inappropriate physical contact as an unspoken toll for his professional support and vital industry endorsement. Whenever a brave young woman decided to firmly establish her personal boundaries and completely reject his deeply unsettling advances, the legendary broadcaster would unleash a terrifyingly vindictive response. He possessed a colossal ego that simply could not process the concept of rejection, especially from individuals he considered significantly beneath his celebrity status. The jovial, larger-than-life radio host would instantly vanish, replaced by a highly malicious adversary who was utterly determined to ensure the dissenting individual was completely erased from the fiercely competitive music and broadcasting landscape. His calculated method of professional annihilation was both incredibly simple and absolutely devastating. If the rejected woman was an aspiring singer, he would completely ban her records from his influential morning show, instructing his loyal producers to permanently discard her promotional materials. If she was a junior radio staff member, he would aggressively complain to senior broadcasting executives, falsely claiming she was totally incompetent and completely disruptive to his creative process. Because he guaranteed massive daily audience ratings, the management consistently sided with their star, leaving the victims utterly defenseless and entirely without a voice. The profound emotional and psychological devastation inflicted upon these discarded women was completely heartbreaking. They were brutally forced out of their dream careers, their immense talents and lifelong ambitions completely crushed by a single, untouchable gatekeeper. Many of these incredibly gifted individuals abandoned the media industry altogether, heavily burdened by the dark knowledge that their strong moral compass had essentially cost them their entire professional future. They suffered in absolute silence for decades, forced to listen to his celebrated voice echoing from radios across the nation, while their own promising lives remained permanently derailed. He continued to enjoy widespread adoration and immense financial success for many years, comfortably protected by an institutional culture that deliberately ignored the terrible suffering of the vulnerable. It was only during the monumental police investigations of the early 2010s that the horrifying truth behind his beloved public persona was finally exposed to the world. His subsequent criminal convictions completely dismantled his glittering broadcasting legacy, serving as a final, chilling reminder of the devastating consequences of absolute power.